Hey friends, this is Kay, and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Thank you everyone so much for being here today. I am very excited about this episode. We are heading to Maine and we will be exploring the Boone Island Lighthouse. Love a good lighthouse, you guys. They always have some great stories, and I think you'll really like this one. But before we get started, I have a podcast I want to introduce you guys to. If you are not listening to them already, you are missing out. They are the Nick of Crime podcast, and I am just obsessed with this podcast. I listen to it every week. These girls keep you on your toes, they keep you entertained, and it's like sitting around talking to your best friends telling stories. You'll love it. So let's go ahead and listen to their trailer.
Hi, creeps and freaks.
Creepies and freakies.
I'm Michelle.
And I'm Courtney.
And we are in the Nick of Crime. We come to you weekly with true crime, some spooks,
and a little bit of comedy.
We focus on being a voice for victims,
but we also like to rake the offenders through the coals.
We can never really seem to take ourselves too seriously, but we do hope you'll join us.
So keep it creepy and stay freaky.
And we will see you next Tuesday.
Bye!
All right, thank you guys so much for listening to them, and go ahead and support them on social media, and you can listen to their podcast wherever you find your podcasts. So let's go ahead and get started. So we are heading to Maine. If you are new to my podcast, I always do a little bit of history first. Love some history. We're going to talk about Maine. We're going to talk about the island that this lighthouse is on, and then we'll get into some spooky stories. So let's talk about Maine, guys. I know absolutely nothing about Maine. I know one person from Maine, and we would just joke with him that he's from Canada. So it was nice to learn some new things this time around. The origin of the name Maine is very unclear. There's a bunch of different theories about it. And the biggest one is that it was named after the French province of Maine. There's a bunch of others where it's like a nautical term, the Maine, or the mainland, or Maine, M-E-Y-N-E, or mainland. And so it's very well debated on where the name Maine came from. It is also the largest of the 6 New England states, and it became a state on March 15th, 1820, and it was the 23rd state, and it became a state because of the Missouri Compromise, because then they allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state. Like I mentioned, Maine is very close to Canada. It's bordered by the Canadian provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick, but then it also borders New Hampshire. Maine is very known for its coastline, super rocky, and then they're a leading producer now in lobsters and blueberries. And living on the East Coast, the lobster was so amazing. Now I grew up in the West, and now I live in the Pacific Northwest. It just doesn't compare to having like a fresh lobster on the East Coast. Oh my gosh. Anyways, so the first European settlements come in. They landed on St. Croix Island in 1604. It was the French that had come in, and it was with Samuel de Champlain and Matthew de Costa. French names, I pronounced them very English. I'm very sorry. And so they named the area Acadia. So if you guys listen to the Louisiana Rougarou episode, we talked about Acadia and these and how the area of Acadiana, these were the people that lived in Canada and Maine who came down to Louisiana into that Acadiana area, and a lot of that French was brought down into New Orleans and Louisiana. So just a cute little tie together. Cute, right? Okay. Anyways. And so French and, English settlers are coming in frequently to the coast of Maine until like the 1750s. That's when the French and Indian War had gone on and the French were defeated. In the 18th century, about the late 18th century, there were huge parts of land in Maine and parts in Massachusetts that were actually sold off by lottery. So there were 2 tracts of 1,000,000 acres, which is 4,000 km2 for the other listeners. I hope that's right. One in southeast Maine and the other in the west, and they were bought by a wealthy Philadelphia banker. His name was William Bingham, and that became known as the Bingham Purchase of that land. I have heard of that. I remember it from history class, but it, if you don't grow up in that area, you probably had no idea also. Industrialization was huge in Maine, especially during the 19th century, and there were all kinds of industrialization that was going on. The river valley areas, they were the area for lumber. They were logging deep into the Maine woods. They were doing pine and spruce, and then they would float it down the river to the sawmills, and then it would be shipped at the different ports along the Maine coast. They also had cotton textile mills, and that kind of came from Massachusetts around the 1820s. In addition to fishing, obviously fishing was a huge part of their economy. Also industries popped up, including granite, slate, quarrying, brickmaking, and shoemaking. Then in the 20th century was when paper industry really came in big there, and the pulp industry, and making paper. And that wood was coming from the Maine woods. It was all very local. The wood pushed down the river to the lumber yards, everything like that. I think this is pretty cool. And so then Ralph Nader, a familiar politician, I don't know anything about him, he famously described Maine in the 1960s as a, quote, paper plantation. Although all these industries were coming in and so much manufacturing, Maine was still very agricultural into the 20th century. The people lived in very small areas, in like villages. And what was the struggle in Maine is because they had very short growing seasons. The soil wasn't great. It was super rocky. And everything there was very remote from, Maine towns where there were markets. And though agriculture remained, it was not a prosperous thing to do. It was not a great way to make a living. It's one of the least prosperous in all the states. And it peaked around the 1850s, but just steadily declined after that. It was not a huge part of their economy. So we run into the California gold rush, and it's like, what? We're in Maine. Yes, so they also called it Ohio fever. And so a lot of the Europeans from the east migrated towards the west, the Oregon Trail, all that. In 1816 is when a huge group of people from Maine really started to move around. The summer was actually very cold up in Maine. It was not ideal. And so people were flocking west to go past the Appalachian Mountains into Ohio. And so Ohio fever was this lure that people knew of the West. They're like, oh, I want to go there. And so the population of Maine just plummeted, and it really stunted the growth of the economy of the state and these cities. And thankfully by the 1820s, the settlement momentum had come back, and that's obviously when Maine achieved its statehood. So as they're traveling into the, frontier, American frontier, they keep going west, and the Mainers, so weird to say that, they really liked Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota because, there was a lot of lumber there, and they knew that trade, and so it was a really easy way for them to transition into a new area. So if you're from those areas, your ancestors maybe came from Maine. And then because of the gold rush and further after, lumber and shipbuilding, became huge because the demand for building lumber to be shipped from Maine all the way to a West Coast sawmill. Shipping was massive in Maine, especially during the gold rush, really needing all of these supplies of lumber to build houses, build mines, things like that. But they would also carry migrants who were coming from wherever, seeking gold. And a lot of the people who really knew lumbering and carpentry very well, they were the ones that really pushed for California and the Pacific Northwest. So in the 19th century, there were a lot of politics, and these people were from Maine, like the mayor of San Francisco, two mayors of San Francisco, two governors of California, a governor of Oregon, and two governors of Washington, and they were all born in Maine. Maine is the first state in the Northeast to support the new anti-slavery Republican Party. Who supported? Past tense. Sorry about that. And a lot of it was because of Protestantism and the influence that had over it. And Abraham Lincoln also came in and chose Hannibal Hamlin as his first vice president, also from Maine. Maine became the first state to pass prohibition. It was signed in 1846 by Governor Hugh J. Anderson. This was after 20 years of advocacy by various native temperance societies. So like areas of Portland, Maine, grew exponentially and created a lot more job opportunities and a lot more people, huger populations. And so the area really became divided. They would call it the two Maines because of the different interests from the north and the eastern areas and north and south, all those. But with that, Portland and a lot of the coastal towns, Maine is the poorest state in the Northeast. A lot of it is because they have high taxes, they have high living costs, but since the 1970s, it has been the poorest state in the United States. And it's found because there is a very high level of welfare dependence in that area over the past half century. So here's some interesting facts for you about Maine as we finish this up. So English colonists were led by a man named George Popham. He established Fort St. George in Maine, 1607, and that was the same year that Jamestown in Virginia was founded. But because of the harsh climate, their leader, George Popham, he had died. And so the colonists went back to England a year later. And so that is why Jamestown is known as the first permanent colony in North America, because those residents stayed and didn't flee, and it could have been Fort St. George in Maine, but it wasn't. So a town named Agamenticus, I looked that up and made sure I said it right. It was the first city to be chartered in the U.S., and this was in 1641. Then it was renamed to Georgiana and incorporated as the first city. And then when the Massachusetts Bay Colony annexed southern western Maine in 1652, Georgiana was reincorporated as York. There was a long stretch of droughts that began in 1947 during that summer, and because of that, fires erupted everywhere and destroyed more than 200,000 acres in what is best known as the year Maine burned. There was an ice storm in 1998. It knocked out power to half the state for more than 2 weeks and resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, and is considered to be the worst natural disaster in Maine's history. Eastport, Maine is the easternmost city in the continental United States. More than 100 million pounds of lobster were harvested off the coast of Maine in 2011. Now, which sucks, it's more expensive. It's now considered a delicacy. But back when, they actually used to feed it to inmates and servants. And then they would like ground up the shells and use them as fertilizer during the colonial era. So it's like, what a difference lobster has made throughout the years, you know? Sorry, my mouse is loud. Last two here. Maine was a district of the state of Massachusetts until 1820, and Maine is the only U.S. state whose name only has one syllable. All right, so what I'm going to get into now is Boone Island. This is the island where the lighthouse resides. I highly recommend you look at a map because it's not like the other lighthouses that I've done where it's like it sits on a rocky cliff in this town, like the one I did in Oregon, Washington, one of those where it was like on a rocky cliff and now it's a state park and stuff. This one's way off there. Yeah, I would definitely just look at a map and you can kind of see how far it is off the coast of Maine. So it's very rocky, very rocky. It's 6 miles off the coast of York, Maine. So 6 miles, it's not that much, but when I looked at the map, I was like, oh my gosh, it looks so far away. So the island is about 300 feet by 700 feet. So it's 91 meters by 210 meters. And this is at low tide. And it is the site of the Boone Island Lighthouse, obviously. And it stands 137 feet high or 42 meters high. And it's the tallest lighthouse in New England. But a lot of vessels have been wrecked because it is such a rocky shoreline also around that lighthouse. So a man named John Winthrop, he was an English Puritan lawyer. He was a huge part of the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he mentioned about passing Boone Island around the 1600s. That's when it was first kind of talked about. Back then, in 1799, there was a wooden day beacon that was erected there, but it only lasted 5 years because the storms in that area are so bad. And Boone Island, its highest point was only 14 feet above sea level. So, you know, storms and high tide is going to get that place. Again, very violent seas. Violent weather. It was said that it could move the boulders around, you know, the rocks and the boulders around its surface and completely could demolish a structure. So then in 1811, they built a stone beacon, a stone lighthouse, and it was built to be 32 feet above the water. Then it was rebuilt in 1831 to go 49 feet above sea level, sorry. But again, storms, violence, the damages, like it was relentless. So in 1854, they built the tallest lighthouse in New England, which is Boone Island Lighthouse, at 133 feet above sea level. And it was made of granite, like huge, massive granite blocks, and cost $25,000, which today's money is $895,000. So there is a house on the island also where the keepers would live, and they had to be boated in. You can only get there by boat, and it was very, very desolate. There were very few keepers, but there was one man. His name was William C. Williams. Why would you name your kid William Williams? Anyways, he thrived there. He loved it. He stayed for 27 years and lived past the age of 90. In 1978, there were 2 lightkeepers that lived there, but they retreated from the island because there was a very powerful winter storm coming. They took shelter in the light chamber because the wind and the sea had demolished all of the other structures on the island, just gone. And at that time, then the waters also rose 5 feet above the tower and dislodged a lot of the material and everything in that tower. So the next day they were rescued by helicopter, and now to this day, the tower has been repaired, is still in service, but it's completely automated. So no one needs to live on the island anymore. And it's solar powered. So, constantly maintained. So how Boone Island kind of got its name, there is a story behind it. So there was a vessel named Increase, and it was in the summer of 1682 was when this happened around the lighthouse. So their vessel had crashed, and it wrecked right on the coast of the lighthouse, and there were 4 survivors, 3 European and 1 Native American. And they survived by eating fish and like seagull eggs. And then they were able to build a fire big enough to attract attention, where someone saw the rising smoke coming from it, and they were able to be rescued. And so the people that were rescued, they said quote, "Seeing their survival as a boon granted by God, the men are said to have dubbed it Boone Island." So I'm not really sure what boon, as a boon, I'm sorry. And I didn't even look it up. I'm sorry. But that's, they were just so elated that they had survived that they called it that. There was another very famous shipwreck. It was December 11th of 1710, and it was a British merchant ship, and its name was Nottingham Galley, and its captain was John Dean. So 14 crew members aboard the ship, they all survived the wreck, the initial wreck, but 2 of them died from their injuries, including the cook, who died a few days after the initial wreck. A carpenter died 2 weeks after, and then another 2 drowned while trying to reach the mainland in this raft that they hastily made. So the 10 remaining men, they managed to stay alive even through the winter conditions. So it said they had no food, no fire for 24 days until finally rescued. They actually resorted to cannibalism. They started to eat the carpenter after his death, and so it gave this incident lore and fame because of that. This story is very much retained to this lighthouse to this day. It's more than just that story also, because there was a conflict between the captain and the members of his crew, mostly his first mate, whose name was Christopher Langman. And they claimed that the captain purposefully wrecked the ship because he wanted to cash in on insurance money. And so when the crew found this out, they mutinied and forced Dean to continue on to Boston. And that is how it resulted in the wreck on Boone Island. So with all that drama, a bunch of them survived, 10 of them survived. That is where public relations had to come in because of the wreck, because of what they found out, the crew, the captain, all of it. And so it really made this story infamous with Boone Island. There's a writer named Kenneth Roberts, and he wrote in 1956 a novel called Boone Island, and he fictionalized the story of the captain wrecking the ship, the cannibalism, all that. So that's a book to check out if you want. There's another one called Boone Island, A True Story of Mutiny, Shipwreck, and Cannibalism by Andrew Vietz and Stephen Erickson. That was in 2012. It's a nonfiction history of Boone Island. So it said that after that, it's known as the Nottingham Galley disaster, that local fishermen would actually leave barrels of provisions on Boone Island in case of future wrecks, so that they did not have to resort to cannibalism. So from what I could tell in the research is that they do it now. Like, there are barrels of provisions on the island. So very interesting. Another, a woman, her name was Rosamond Thaxter, She built a cottage in 1951 on an island. It's probably the best island name I've ever heard, and I want to live there and just read books. You'll see what kind of books. The island's name is Smutty Nose. I love it. I like to read smutty, dark romance, whatever. Anyway, so Smutty Nose Island is where Rosamond built her cottage, and she actually opened it up to mariners that were in distress because of the weather. And again, it had tons of provisions for the survivors of the shipwrecks. A man named Warren Reese, he worked for the University of Maine. In 1995, he went out on an expedition to try to find artifacts from the Nottingham Gale, and they actually found quite a bit. I didn't push further into that research, but there are items that were recovered, and they are at the Maine State Museum, so you can see them. February 1944, there was a ship named the Empire Knight. It was 428 feet or 130 meters long. It was a British freight ship, and it hit Boone Island and actually broke into two sections. The stern section, which included the cargo holds of the freighter, sank instantly. And about 260 feet or 80 meters down. And they were about 1.5 miles or so from the island, so 2 or 3 kilometers. Then, with that, it wasn't until 1990 where more of it was kind of looked into or found. The U.S. Coast Guard became aware of the existence of that freighter and what they were carrying. So from 1994, the ship had 221 flasks or 7,620 kilograms of mercury that had been on the vessel. So they did an investigation about it, and they confirmed that they were loaded on that ship, but they had deteriorated, and that meant that they were releasing the mercury. So it is estimated about 16,000 pounds or 7.25 tons of mercury still remain unrecovered in that area and is believed to have settled in the low point of the cargo hold. Isn't that crazy? I don't know. There's so much on here I should have looked more into, but I don't know how that affects the fishing, how it affects the wildlife, all that, but that's pretty insane. So I'm going to go more into the lighthouse and kind of the spookiness of it. So I'm going to quote an article first. So it's called Hauntings at Boone Island Lighthouse in Maine. Lighthouse bride goes insane over husband's death. This was written by Alan Wood in January 1st, 2021. And it's a story that we haven't addressed yet, so I wanted to quote his article because it's very good. So, quote, "This story is one that has gone into folklore and legend at Boone Island Lighthouse in Maine, as proper documentation from the mid-1800s regarding this incident is not available. The tragic story reminds us of the physical and emotional danger of living on a remote lighthouse for many lighthouse keepers and their wives. The position can sound exciting in the 1800s to many a young bride of a keeper, but it can be a place of emotional stress miles away from the mainland. There are stories of many keepers who died in their positions from tragic accidents or sickness from the deplorable conditions they were placed under. Sometimes their records of duty served were lost or may have been removed from a short duration of service. This is one of those stories which has become part of Maine folklore, as the keeper mentioned in this blog is not found any records I could find, but there were many who believed its authenticity, including those that witnessed specific events that occurred long after he and his wife's death. Boone Island sits atop a tiny barren island of rock measuring 400 square miles and rises only about 14 feet above sea level at its highest point. The lighthouse is the tallest beacon in New England. The rocky shoal measures roughly 700 by 300 feet, and most of it lies underwater at high tide. It's located about 6 miles from the town of York, Maine, shoreline, and was the site of many shipwrecks over the years, and there have been many sightings of a female ghost at Boone Island. Most believe it is the distraught wife of former keeper Lucas Bright, who had gone insane after the keeper had drowned on Boone Island during a gale storm. Sometime in the mid-1800s, first assistant Lucas Bright arrived at Boone Island Lighthouse with his new bride Catherine. 4 months after they arrived on the tiny barren rock, gale-force winds from a severe December nor'easter storm were blowing across the tiny island, sending huge waves over the rocky island. Lucas Bright was feeling ill from the past week and physically exhausted, but felt the need to check the tower to make sure the lantern was lit for any mariners stuck in the storm, so they may find safety near the shore. He tied a rope to his waist and kissed his wife as he left the warm house into the biting winds and spray towards the tower. The waves were breaking all around him, coating the rocks in sheets of ice as he tried to secure a bolt to the door to the tower. All of a sudden, a huge rogue wave swept over the rocks and covered the keeper. He had lost his grasp, slipped on the icy rocks in the freezing waters, and drowned. Catherine saw that accident in horror and managed to grab and hold onto the rope tied to her husband to keep him from drifting away. She went out into the storm and somehow managed to pull her husband's body ashore, then proceeded to drag it over the ice-covered rocks into the lighthouse tower, leaving his body at the foot of the stairs. Overcome with grief and shock, she sat with her husband and held his hand for as long as she could bear. The storm continued, and Catherine knew she had to tend to the light so others may not find the same fate as her beloved. For 5 days and nights during this seemingly endless storm, Catherine, stricken with grief, took over the lighthouse duties. She ate what little food was left and slept little. Each day she climbed the tower's 168 stairs to the lantern room in freezing temperatures and lit the lamp to protect any mariners or fishermen still out during the storm. She would then stay near her husband's frozen corpse, sometimes holding his hand or hugging him, talking to him as to comfort her. On the 6th day, when the storm had finally passed, Catherine had nearly run out of fuel and was too exhausted and tormented to light the lighthouse, causing the light to go out. Once the light had gone out and with the seas calming, fishermen from York went out to the lighthouse to investigate. They found no one in the house and went out to the tower. The tower's temperature had fallen to freezing 10 degrees below zero. There they found Catherine Bright, freezing from exposure and driven mad by grief and exhaustion. She was sitting on the bottom of the stairs holding the frozen corpse of her husband. The fishermen were able to bring Catherine and her husband's corpse ashore, but by the time she'd completely lost her mind, and she died a short time later after being rescued. Over the years afterwards, many mariners and keepers laid claim to have seen a ghostly figure of a young, sad-faced woman shrouded in white on the rocks at dusk. At times, sounds of moans and screeches were also claimed to have been heard many times after the incident. In some nights, keepers at the lighthouse claimed they would hear knocking on the door, and as they opened the door, they would see a faint apparition of a woman dressed in white heading to the tower. Sometimes a keeper would bring their cat or dog to the Boone Island, but most of these animals would refuse to go in the lighthouse tower. Some dogs have been witnessed to be chasing something around the rocks, barking constantly as if to give warning. One Coast Guard keeper in the early 1970s became a believer of the ghost stories when he and fellow crewmen were off the tiny rock island fishing and drifted too far out to make it back in time to turn the light on before dark. There wasn't a person on the island, but somehow the light was glowing brightly by the time the keepers returned. He also claimed to have heard doors mysteriously opening and closing, where he would go to turn on the fog signal. He felt as if someone was watching him. Another former Coast Guard keeper, David Wells, reported that one time the station's Labrador Retriever chased, quote, something from one end of the island to the other and back again. He couldn't see what the dog was chasing and later stated, quote, we figured the island must be haunted, but nothing ever bothered us. Many mariners and locals believe it is Catherine watching over the lighthouse, end quote. That is the end of that article. I really liked how the details he put in that story. So then 20th, 21st century, the lighthouse changed a lot of ownership. It couldn't keep the keepers there. It was a mess. And so then in 1978, there was another huge ocean storm, and 2 of the island's keepers were barely able to escape the storm because, again, they hid in the tower. And that storm and the seas and everything, it damaged the fuel tanks, the helicopter pad, the generator building, the boathouse, and the boat launch. And so that's when they really decided that this isn't safe anymore. We need to automate this. So 2012, Boone Island was actually put up for sale by the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000, which, this is long, but it, quote, eligible federal, state, and local agencies, nonprofit corporations, educational agencies, and community development organizations to be used for educational research, cultural, or historic preservation purposes. But no one bid on it. You know, it's known in Maine as this cursed lighthouse. And so it went into an online auction, and it was bought by a real estate developer for $78,000, and he actually flipped it. So as a current owner, it's with Boone Island LLC. It's still abandoned. You can take tours of it on a boat. You cannot go in it or land on the island. It has an automated light that still flashes for the passing ships, and they say it has like a gravitational pull to it that the sailors feel very attracted to this lighthouse. So yeah, again, you can take tours of it. You can't go inside, unfortunately, but you can tour the island in a boat going around it. So yeah, so that is Boone Island Lighthouse in Boone Island, Maine. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I appreciate it. And if you liked it, please go on and rate and review on Apple, Spotify, everywhere you find your podcast. That would be amazing, amazing. If you would like to follow me, I have an Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and a TikTok. And I have a Patreon also if you would like to support the show. So join us next week for episode 41. We're going to be heading to North Dakota. So a little change of pace from being in the east and moving a little further west to one that I think is going to be super, super creepy. So yeah, that would be next Wednesday. After that, on March 23rd, the day after, we will have a new Zodiac episode, and we're going to be exploring the sign of Aries. Then the Wednesday after, episode 42, we're going to go to Maryland, head back east. So yeah, join me for those amazing times. Thank you again all for listening. It means so much to me, and I appreciate it so much. You'll never understand how much I appreciate it. It's easy to want to quit. I've been in that stage multiple times with this, but seeing constant listens, I don't want to give up quite yet. So thank you all for your support. And I will see you next Wednesday. Bye.